Hi, this is Dan Haagman. Today, I've got a very interesting guest talking with me about cybersecurity and the board evolving more from assurance to expertise. I'd like to introduce Matt Foster. Matt is the head of cybersecurity for Lookers. I've known Matt a long time, and we work very, very closely together. It's an absolute pleasure because I feel, a relationship of equals where we're always sharing information. We are always comparing notes, learning from each other, which is the way it should be. And Matt, let's just jump straight in. I know we've been talking a lot about incidents, purple teaming, crisis management, and so on and so forth. So in your role, you've obviously got a multi-billion-pound company to look after, lots and lots of very interesting challenges. Share with me at the moment, just to get this conversation going, the top things that are in your mind at the moment and the things that you've been discussing with other industry peers as well.
Well, Dan, thanks for having me today. I think it's really important to sort of share some of the journey we've been on because we face such similar problems as others do. And what's top of the list right now? Well, cyber, I think, stays top of our risk rating internally as part of our enterprise risk framework, as I'm sure it is for so many others. But we sit in that position of catastrophic impact, really low probability. So I think the days of us being able to dashboard up theoretical control maturity, I think we're coming towards the end of that. It's not a paper-based exercise anymore. It's not good enough to bring the auditors in, whether external or internal, and tick the boxes along. Security isn't a tick box exercise, right? We've got to test those controls. And I think we'll start to see boards, non-executive directors start to evolve from assurance to a level of expertise there where they have a greater understanding of what's going on. So we will get asked harder questions as we move along. And the only way that we can demonstrate, to my mind, that we're providing that necessary level of control is by testing the controls in the real world, with increasingly lack of oversight from the blue team or the defenders, if you like.
Interesting. So now you're not just knowing the way you think, you're not referring to just testing the controls from a technical perspective, are you? I'm guessing you're looking at the exec as well and testing them.
Well, there are two interesting dimensions to that, which I think are worth picking up on first. We have focused very much on technical controls in the past. You know, we look at protect, we look at detect, even in respond and recover, we're always interested in our backup capability instead of our restore capability. Somebody said to me the other week, no one wants a drill, they want a hole. And the techie in me was outraged because I care deeply about what sort of drills I use to make holes. But actually, the people who want the holes, it really is about the hole. So we've got to look at the human element in our controls and how that makes things weak, the interactions, the non-conformance with the process. But we've got to look at the role that the exec and senior leadership play in helping us manage those existential cyber crises. You know, we've been talking about playbooks and responses within our teams for as long as I can remember. Well, here at Lookers, we introduced a playbook for the exec. What's their role to play when we have that existential Matt needs some help kind of moment? And just this very week, we role played them through a tabletop exercise to get them used to the kind of decisions that they need to make, the kind of decisions which day to day are to do with the running of the company they don't have the time to make anymore, and they need to delegate out and to challenge some of those assumptions. And it's hugely valuable exercise. No plan survives first engagement with the enemy. But a plan that's at least been through one iteration has got an awful lot better chance of surviving the real world.
So this is interesting. So you're talking about playbooks, run books, and actually practically testing them. Now, I have heard from so many people now that there is a real interesting debate about how much the exec is hands-on versus how much security can be hands-on. And then you've got all these things that crises always happen at the wrong time and bank holidays, when other people are not around. Tell me your thinking, Matt, not just in terms of, your current organization, but what you've seen with other people in how do they need escalations to the CEO or the CRO to kind of, get privilege, permission, how much autonomy is given to the organization? What are the different models and perspectives? Because there's plenty of ways of doing this.
There are, and I think if you haven't taken the time to structure this through in advance, when you've got the time to think about it logically, where it hasn't happened, it is chaotic at best when terrible things happen. It really doesn't matter what kind of delegation matrix that you put in place, but there has to be a level of protection in place, because some of the actions we will need to take as cyber professionals in responding to an incident will have impact on revenue, the business's overall health. So just as we're starting to see a lot more of the D&O protection kind of debate starting up, especially in America, we've got to have some kind of level of formal coverage in place so that we truly feel empowered to act in these situations. And I think that will follow over to Europe, as so much of the blame culture or regulation or culpability piece tends to do. The exec need to feel that they're part of it. That's their job at the end of the day, to run the business and to have enough guidance in place from experts to be sure that the right things are happening. And one thing that I learned from our recent exercise is that I need to spend more time in that crisis management meeting, whatever format it's taking, and likely it's going to be virtual. And I did have a thought that maybe we should start shipping people into an office, because interaction is hard enough under the pressure as it is. Don't underrate the value of all being in the same room. But I had in my head that I would be busy making sure that our partners, my team, are all working and providing the necessary evidence, controls, mitigation, whatever it is. But actually, I probably need to let the team get on with that, and I need to be spending more time feeding the exec with the information we have. A cyber incident is never going to be a complete information situation, but the more information I can get to them quicker, the better chance they have of making that call, whether we roll up the shutters and send everyone home for 2 days, or whether we carry on with post-it notes everywhere. These are existential decisions, and they're only going to make them if they have they're going to make the most effective version of that decision if they have as much information as we can feed them. So my big takeaway from this is keep the plan, stay to the plan. You'll find in the first 15 minutes that until somebody in the room says, but we've got a plan, you'll be all over the place. It always happens. Somebody's got to be there. Somebody's got to track those actions, and then keep that information flow going. It's absolutely the lifeblood. We're kind of that critical friend of the exec to feed them the information they need.
And on that note, a couple of things spring to mind. There's one that's just popped into my head, which is really interesting, which is when you mentioned virtual, but I'll come to that in just a moment. What happens when key people are not there? Sickness, holidays, uncontactable, something's kicking off quickly. Where does your mind go with that? Key members of that plan, and how do you mitigate that, and how do you work around that?
So it's crucial you have a set of deputies set up. I think that goes without saying. But inevitably, unless you're in a giant multinational organization, you're going to start causing crossover, right? We have about 6,500 people working for us. And once you get down to a level of deputy, there is crossover. You just don't have that depth in the senior experts, if you like, in the organization. So you need to rehearse those deputies and you need to cross skill. And I think the next time we run a simulation round, you've got to allow for burnout. The chances of the A team being available, as you've hinted at, when the incident starts is pretty much zero. And 30 hours into that incident, that A team is going to need to be sleeping. So you've got to think about how you transition things across. So, that doesn't mean we need 3 Matt Fosters in the organization just in case one of them's on holiday and we can rotate the other 2. But it means we need a minimum level of competence and understanding of the areas in across people. It doesn't have to be their day job, right? And the biggest thing about exercises like this is pre-can as many of the decisions as you possibly can. Not death by decision tree, but kind of those strategic assumptions, whether it's your strategic point on whether to pay ransoms or not, your strategic point about once exfiltration has been proven, what do you do at that point? Pre-can as many of those decisions as you can, and then you'll remove some of the need for expertise in the room.
Very interesting, actually. I read recently a quote, and it says, it's far easier to make great decisions early. And I really thought about that in seeing that play out. Another interesting challenge, and I'll come on to my virtual question in a moment, is so many companies, even if they're in one locality as their primary trading, for example, United Kingdom, or they could be multinational, either way, with their workforce is now remote, we can have people literally across the globe. So in our scenario, we've got everyone from sort of, well, our scenarios are PST through to New Zealand time, and there's not a lot in between there. So it's a very interesting scenario when it's a rolling, maybe that's also a solution of the burnout point as well you make. It's a rolling awakening, if you like, physically, of people getting up and seeing their messages in the first instance. So what's your view about that kind of diverse workforce versus multinational with people who naturally will not know because they're asleep?
I think you're partially right in that the challenge is also part of the solution. You do get some of that, we've talked about follow the sun call centers forever. Well, why can't we do this with crisis management as well? And it highlights the need, whether you are global and multi-time zone or you're just in a single geography, it highlights the need for great record keeping. Nothing can be more important than during a crisis that, first of all, you make the decision points. Well, first of all, somebody really needs to be checking that those actions have happened. It's easy for the red traits in our personalities to come out at these moments, and we make a snap decision, hopefully a pre-canned one that we've met the criteria from. We snap out an instruction to turn off the website. And on we go on to the next chunk of who's going to talk to who. Have we checked that's actually happened? Who's following up on it? That record keeping. But guess what? Almost inevitably, there is going to be some kind of investigation at some point if we're talking about an existential cyber exercise. Might just be internal audit if you're lucky. If you work in a regulated sector, and the people to whom that applies is only growing, sooner or later your regulator is going to want to know what happened. Your equivalent of the ICO is going to know what happened. You can't remember what happened 30 minutes ago in events, pressure events like this. So you've got to have those records which facilitate both great handover as the teams rotate along, tell that story, tell that timeline, but also to mean that the future investigation will be a less traumatic event for you.
Interesting. What they say, number one principle of audit in IT, if it's written down, it happened.
Yeah, and that's not just IT, right? That's the stock markets of the world as well. If it and health service, if it's not written down, it didn't happen.
Interesting. Now, this is why I like these discussions. We don't pre-script them, as you know, and they just organically flow. And you've given me a thought, which I oddly have never, ever thought about, which is this. We're in crisis management mode. We've got our scenarios, everything else. It's a breach scenario. How do we communicate with each other on the same network that is being breached potentially? Interesting. Do we have can you look at and think about the virtues of in-band / out-of-band communication? And let's say, we're in crisis, so we invoke something outside of the org for safety, but now suddenly all our record keeping, access to notes, the plans are not necessarily available. They may not physically be available because we can't connect. So what are your thoughts? Where does your brain go with this? Because this is a potential reality, isn't it?
It very much is, particularly as we move to more sort of converged identity. That great benefit of single sign-on and that great user experience also comes with it great impact should the administration of that area get hit. So generally, if you've got a real root infestation, chances are your collaboration is untrustworthy. And when we go through the planning for this kind of thing, it feels a bit like the year 2000 all over again, when we were busy issuing people with satellite phones, which in those days really were brick, just in case. But you have to cover this stuff off. You've got to assume it's not available. You can't go to the end, but what if the online storage isn't available? I carry around a hardware encrypted USB key with me, as does our head of business continuity, with the plans on them. We make sure that stuff is synced to laptops. We have analog phone bridge capabilities, cell phone bridge capabilities, which will set up on an ad hoc basis if you think your collaboration is being compromised. Might be available, but they might be listening to everything, right? But the other point that came out on this for me whilst we were going through was that the scenario we'd played out had a little bit of a time bomb, a sleeper kind of piece of malware that had been sitting in there. And this threw me a completely different curveball, which is along the similar kind of lines, which is why I thought of it. At some point, your decision tree says, restore your last known good backup. Oh, wonderful. Well, that's all right. It was Tuesdays, but this sleeper piece of malware has been in our network for 3 months. Okay, how do I know how? I'm going through periodic restore tests, and maybe they're not good enough to test the full integrity of the full bare metal restore. Who can afford to do that, right? Do a periodic full bare metal restore? Nobody, I suspect. But how do you validate the integrity of your backups when you have identified a sleeper piece of malware of some description sitting inside your network? Same kind of problem, except I don't have an answer to that one, but it's kind of crept up to the top of my list now.
It's a really interesting one, isn't it? It sort of leads loosely into another component, which is something I know that you and I have thrown around so much as a debate. And if we look at traditional security controls testing, whatever those controls may well be, looking at an application, advanced phishing, whatever it might be, whatever use case it might be. And my view of this, when you see so many people investing huge investments of security, architecture, monitoring, SOC, SIEM, response, testing, blah, 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 blah. But then they still apply this old approach, which is, here's your yearly test, here is your compliance audit, blah, blah, blah. And then we've got this large window. Now, I know you've been evolving your thinking into more of a continuous model, and also not just the traditional box, if you think of it like that. Here's an application, test me, and then my single sign-on hasn't been tested ever, if that makes sense. So tell me about that kind of thinking, Matt. You've gone multimodal and spread it out over time in your thinking, haven't you? Why have you done that, and what's been the advantage and disadvantages?
Well, I wish I had a fully baked solution that would solve the problem, Dan, but we started down the journey. And if you think about, I don't know, using something like NIST on this 2.0. I'm still not quite worked out in my head what that means. Topic for another day, maybe. And you have your control assessments around your spider diagram, and you go, oh, there's 20 odd of them. Let's do a couple of months, and we'll get around it in a year. Hurrah! That's probably no good, right? We talk about the speed of response that we need. So I'm trying to move towards a risk to threat based evaluation or frequency of control evaluation. So if it's physical security of the data center, somebody watching this will doubtless tell me that I'm not aware of the most recent development, but in general, if we're tank proof in our physical security, it's good enough, and we can probably wait a couple of years before we reevaluate that. If we're looking at the phishability of our staff, we probably need to reevaluate that almost on a continuous basis. So some of it we can do from looking at our threat intel feeds and our horizon scanning and work through how are these things evolving. And we've sort of hinted it about a little bit with your backups are good. I think we're starting to see, or we will start to see, a trend towards attacks on integrity rather than availability or confidentiality. That means we're going to have a completely different problem to solve. So we start to, based on both our threat intel and how we see the risk horizon moving, we assess the control areas that impacts more frequently. And we do that by providing a non-theoretical level of assurance. We engage through purple teaming, through getting us to have a pop at ourselves. But I think increasingly the red teaming element, the unannounced element, has got to be there. Speed of infiltration, I think we will start to slow down. It's far too easy when you're running a purple event internally. Inevitably, the guys playing defense are on high alert. And equally, if you get spray gunned with a relatively targeted attack, and we've seen enough of them in the past, as many have, you go to a higher alert level. And that's not just the security professionals, that's the human elements in the chain as well, those bits that are vulnerable to social engineering. Matt goes stomping around reminding everyone that no remote resets and that kind of thing, and it lands in people's minds and then it trickles down. We got to get, and I've certainly taken my time getting to this, we got to get to a more continuous approach to our control assurance. Continuous doesn't mean we're doing it every month. It certainly doesn't mean we're doing it once a year as an annual exercise. It means as the risk profile changes or our control effectiveness changes, and that's maybe because it's a while since we've done the last one. I saw a great guest keynote recently about optimism bias, and that trend of, I'm going to call it familiarity breeds contempt, right? And one of the bits that stuck in my head from it was when Norway, and apologies if it was Sweden, changed which side of the road they drove on in the 50s, and apologies if it was the 60s, I can't remember the details. The point was they changed over one day, so they were the same as the whole of Scandinavia. And you'd think that's a pretty terrifying thing to do. And road traffic accidents, you'd think, would be a disaster on the day. No, absolutely not. Essentially zero road traffic accidents because people were super focused in on it. And for the next 2 years, road traffic accidents were super low. But then as people got used to driving on the other side of the road, the wrong side of the road, as we Brits would say, guess what? RTAs came up to the right level again. And that's because they're used to it. And we've known about this forever with our security warning banners on emails. Someone gets phished and we sit there and go, really, why didn't they read the warning banner on the email? Well, Matt, it's because the same warning banner is on pretty much every single email in their inbox. Familiarity has bred contempt, and they're just blind to them. The brain filters them out because they're there all the time. So it's not just about how we put warnings and detections in front of people, but it's about how we test them and keep it fresh and current. If people think, and behavioral science tells us this, if people think that threats are real and likely to get through or happen to them, why do people make risky decisions? Because nothing bad's ever happened to them. If we keep it fresh, our controls will be much more effective. So we need to be doing continuous assessment of our control effectiveness based on the changing threat landscape. Have I got a perfect answer to how we get there? No, but I'm sure as hell going to give it a try.
That is really, really interesting as a whole thread of behavioral science, and gives me an idea for perhaps another conversation together. We're running towards the end of our session, so I've got a very, very interesting point about the humans and the super focusedness and routing them down that route. And I know this is something you and I have debated in a really, really interesting way. And again, the joy of this, we've both been around in cyber for so long, but it's when you get together that the ideas come around, which is this: you get bias based on KPIs. Tell me you're thinking of that, because that was just an epiphany that just came out of one of our cups of coffee, didn't it?
Oh yes, this was a proper light bulb moment for me. So thanks for bringing it up, because it is so worth sharing. So we've spoken about why people are blind to warnings that we put in. Steve Riley at Microsoft nearly 2 decades ago, when we put it in with Vista, called it the "show me the dancing pigs" effect. Somebody emails you and says, "I've got an email with some amazing dancing pigs," and Vista would pop up this box saying, "Are you sure?" And it had all sorts of technical blurb in it, and all people saw was "showing you the dancing pigs." Well, if you think about why don't people take cyber more seriously in their jobs, we typically incentivize people to do things in jobs, whether it's commission basis on sales, whether it's performance indicators for the service desk. And I think that's the example we want to talk about here. Who doesn't incentivize their IT service desk in terms of average speed of answer? And the one I really want to drill in is first contact resolution. That's what we measure them on. That's what they're supposed to do. That's what they get the pats on the back for. That's what they get the extra dollars in the bank account for. And generally, that's a great thing, right? Who wants to bother our tech teams with stuff that we can shift left to the service desk? Amazing. So we've incentivized that whole idea into them of fix it whilst the person is on the phone. That means do it now. That means don't validate it. Well, that's great until it's a social engineering attack, and you really do need to check with Matt and his team whether it's going in. So we had a recent spate of quite bold social attacks coming in, not just IT, but also HR, in fact. And as a result of it, we have already changed the metrics on which we incentivize our service desk. We haven't worked out what the good security one looks like, but we've pulled any security related tickets out of the first contact resolution KPI, because Matt's stomping around saying, under no circumstances will you do this. And meanwhile, behind them is a giant dashboard with a stopwatch going, right? Let's incentivize the behavior we want to happen, and let's measure it. And sometimes subconsciously, we measure the wrong behavior.
You embedded it, it's helpful, and it's predetermined through, the design of helping people. So fascinating that. And I think that's a real light bulb moment. And, it was just wonderful conjuring that together and figuring it out. And, both of us looking at each other and going, goodness me, that's a real use case. And more importantly, it's now not an abuse case. It's gone, which is just awesome. I'm very conscious of time, so I'd like to say thank you. Matt Foster, Head of Cybersecurity at Lookers, always a pleasure. Love working with you and sharing our wider collabs, coffees, and industry thoughts as well. Thank you for your time.
Great to talk as always, Dan. Thanks.
Thank you.